High in the Colorado Rockies, where winter winds cut like knives and trust comes harder than gold, Magnus bear Thornfield towers over 7 feet tall with hands that could crush a man's skull. The townspeople whisper he's more beast than human, living alone in his fortress like cabin, emerging only when supplies run low or trouble needs settling. But what they don't know is that this giant carries the gentlest heart in 3 counties, and a government deadline that threatens to strip away everything he's built. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, bearing the official seal of the territorial government. Bear's massive fingers had trembled as he read the decree. Unmarried men could no longer claim homestead rights to parcels exceeding 100 acres. He had 6 months to wed or forfeit the 2,000 acres he'd carved from wilderness with his own bloodied hands. Mayor Hutchins had organized the introductions with all the enthusiasm of a man arranging his own funeral. One by one, the eligible women of Cedar Ridge had climbed the treacherous mountain path to Bear's cabin. Mrs. Patterson's eldest daughter had fainted at the sight of him splitting firewood. The preacher's niece had stammered through 5 minutes of painful conversation before excusing herself to tend an imaginary sick relative. Even the widow Morrison, desperate enough to consider any prospect, had taken one look at Bear's enormous frame filling his doorway and claimed a sudden calling to missionary work in California. Bear couldn't blame them. At 7 feet and 3 inches, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and a black beard that reached his chest, he understood why mothers pulled their children close when he walked Cedar Ridge's dusty Main Street. The scars crisscrossing his knuckles told stories of survival in unforgiving wilderness, while his voice, roughened by years of solitude, emerged as a low rumble that made horses skittish. What they couldn't see was how those same scarred hands had nursed an injured sparrow back to health last spring, building a tiny splint from matchsticks and thread. They didn't know about the leather-bound volumes of Shakespeare and Wordsworth hidden behind his practical supplies, or how he'd taught himself to read by candlelight during endless winter nights. They couldn't hear the lullabies he hummed while tending his small garden, melodies his mother had sung before the fever took her when he was 12. The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday, bringing supplies and the usual collection of travelers seeking fortune or escape in the Colorado Territory. Bear was loading sacks of flour onto his wagon when he noticed her, a young woman with auburn hair pinned severely back and clothes that spoke of better days now long past. She moved with purpose despite the exhaustion etched in her features, those green eyes scanning the town with the wariness of someone accustomed to watching for threats. "That's her," whispered Mrs. Henderson to her companion, their voices carrying across the dusty street. The one Mayor Hutchins mentioned, Elena something, arrived with nothing but a carpet bag and enough coin for a week's lodging. Bear's attention sharpened as he watched Elena navigate the curious stares of townspeople. There was steel in her spine despite her obvious weariness, and something familiar in the way she positioned herself near walls, always keeping exits in sight. He recognized the stance of someone who'd learned to survive. Their eyes met across the street, and Bear braced himself for the usual reaction, fear, revulsion, or that particular combination of both that he'd grown accustomed to over the years. Instead, Elena's gaze held steady, studying him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. Not the calculating assessment of a woman weighing a potential husband's assets, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of one wounded soul acknowledging another. Mayor Hutchins appeared at Elena's elbow, gesturing enthusiastically in Bear's direction. Even from across the street, Bear could see the politician's eager smile as he no doubt explained the town's unusual matrimonial opportunity. Elena listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, occasionally glancing toward Bear with that same measuring look. When Hutchins finished his pitch, Bear expected Elena to make some polite excuse and disappear into the mercantile or boarding house like every other woman had done. Instead, she said something that made the mayor's eyebrows shoot toward his receding hairline. After a moment of animated discussion, Hutchins nodded vigorously and began making his way across the street. "Mr. Thornfield," the mayor called out, slightly breathless from his hurried approach. "Might I have a word? The young lady would like to meet you properly." Bear's hands stilled on the flour sack. In 3 weeks of failed introductions, no woman had requested a proper meeting. They'd all preferred the safety of formal parlor visits with chaperones and predetermined escape routes. He glanced back across the street where Elena waited, still watching him with those steady green eyes that seemed to see past the intimidating exterior everyone else feared. For the first time since receiving that government letter, Bear felt something besides resignation stir in his chest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge when Eliza stepped out of the boarding house. Her worn leather satchel clutched firmly in her gloved hands. She'd barely slept, her mind churning over yesterday's commotion and the haunted look she'd glimpsed in those storm-grey eyes before the crowd had swallowed him whole. "You'd best steer clear of that one, miss." Eliza turned to find a woman in her 50s approaching, her greying hair pulled back in a severe bun. The woman's eyes held a mixture of concern and warning. "I'm Mrs. Hartwell. Run the general store with my husband." She gestured toward a weathered building across the street. "Saw you yesterday when that business with Blackwood happened. You looked, well, you didn't look properly terrified." "Should I have been?" Eliza asked, adjusting her shawl against the morning chill. Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew troubled. "Most folks would say yes. He's not a man to trifle with, lives up in those mountains like some kind of wild thing, only comes to town when he absolutely must, and even then—" She shuddered delicately. "The stories they tell about what he's done, what he's capable of." Eliza had heard whispers about stories, but she'd learned long ago that whispers often bore little resemblance to truth. "What kind of stories?" "Killed 3 men in Denver before he came here. Some say it was more." Mrs. Hartwell leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They say he can track a man for days through wilderness that would kill most folks. Never loses his quarry." The words should have chilled Eliza, but instead she found herself thinking of the way his massive frame had tensed when the crowd pressed closer, like a cornered animal preparing to bolt rather than attack. "Why does he need a wife?" Mrs. Hartwell blinked, clearly surprised by the question. "Land grant requires it. His pa died last winter, left him the claim, but the territorial government won't recognize it unless he's married and settled proper-like. Got until the end of the month, or they'll auction it off. And no one will have him." "Would you?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice pitched higher. "The man's dangerous as a rattlesnake and twice as unpredictable. Besides, what woman wants to live up in that god-forsaken wilderness, miles from civilization?" Eliza's gaze drifted toward the mountains, rising like ancient sentinels beyond the town's edge. She'd known wilderness before, known what it meant to survive with only your wits and determination. Sometimes the wild places were safer than the civilized ones. "I need work," she said, changing the subject. "Is there anywhere in town that might hire a woman?" Mrs. Hartwell's demeanor shifted, becoming more businesslike. "Can you cook? Clean? The boarding house might need help. Or there's the schoolhouse. Can you read and write proper?" "I can do both." Eliza had learned to read by candlelight in stolen moments, taught herself to write by scratching letters in dirt when paper was too precious to waste. "But I was thinking of something more independent." "Independent?" Mrs. Hartwell frowned. "What kind of independence you talking about?" Before Eliza could answer, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A lone rider was approaching from the direction of the mountains, his broad shoulders unmistakable even at a distance. Several townspeople noticed too, quickly finding reasons to disappear into nearby buildings. "Speak of the devil," Mrs. Hartwell muttered, but she didn't flee like the others. Instead, she watched with the wary attention of someone observing a dangerous but fascinating creature. As he drew closer, Eliza could see the details that distance had obscured yesterday. His dark hair hung past his collar, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. His clothes were well made but practical, built for hard use rather than appearance. Everything about him spoke of a man who'd learned to depend on himself alone. He dismounted outside the general store with fluid grace despite his size, his movements economical and precise. For a moment, his gaze swept the street and landed on Eliza. She felt the impact of that look like a physical thing, intense and searching. Then he turned and disappeared into the store. "Well," Mrs. Hartwell said after a moment, "I'd best get back. Thomas will wonder where I've gotten to." She paused, studying Eliza's face. "You take care, miss. Whatever brought you to Cedar Ridge, don't let curiosity about that man make your troubles worse." Eliza nodded absently, her attention still focused on the store where he'd vanished. Mrs. Hartwell was probably right. The smart thing would be to find steady work, keep her head down, and build the quiet life she'd come here seeking. But as she stood there in the morning light, she couldn't shake the memory of how alone he'd looked in that crowd of hostile faces, or the way something deep inside her had responded to that solitude with recognition rather than fear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Elena made her way toward the general store, her worn boots clicking softly against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. She'd spent a restless night in the cramped room above Murphy's Tavern, her mind churning over the strange encounter with the mountain man and the peculiar announcement that had sent every other woman in town fleeing. The store's bell chimed as she pushed through the door, and conversations immediately died. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, clutched her basket tighter and hurried past without making eye contact. Two other women whispered urgently near the fabric bolts before gathering their skirts and practically running from the store. "Don't mind them," came a gruff voice from behind the counter. Samuel Morrison, the store's owner, emerged from the back room carrying a crate of canned goods. His weathered face bore the kind of deep lines that spoke of too many harsh winters and not enough laughter. Whole town's gone mad since yesterday's announcement. Elena approached the counter, pulling her small coin purse from her reticule. "I need some basic supplies. Salt, flour, coffee if you have it." Morrison studied her with curious eyes as he gathered her items. "You planning on staying long, miss? Most folks passing through don't bother stocking up on staples." "I'm considering it," she replied carefully. "It seems like a town that could use someone willing to stay." The older man paused in his work, giving her a long look. "You know what happened yesterday, don't you? About Ezra Blackwood's situation?" Elena nodded. "I heard something about it." Morrison leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the now empty store. "That man's been up on his mountain for nigh on 15 years, built himself a spread up there that'd make most ranchers weep with envy. But his pa was smart, put it in the will that the land goes to family, and if there ain't no family by Ezra's 35th birthday, it goes to the territorial government. And his birthday is soon?" 6 weeks. Morrison shook his head. Ezra's pa, Josiah, he was hoping his boy would settle down natural-like. But after what happened with that Sarah girl, he trailed off, seeming to realize he was sharing more than intended. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. What happened with Sarah? The store owner's face darkened. 3 years back there was a girl, pretty little thing from back east, came here to teach school. Ezra took a shine to her, and miracle of miracles, she seemed to like him too. They were planning to marry. Morrison's hands stilled on the counter. Then one morning they found her at the bottom of Miller's Creek ravine, broken neck. Elena's breath caught. An accident. That's what the sheriff said. But folks started whispering about Ezra's temper, about how he gets when the dark moods take him, about his pa and the stories from the old days. Morrison's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Blackwood men got cursed blood, some say. Violence follows them like a shadow. The bell chimed again, and both Elena and Morrison looked up to see a young man entering. He was perhaps 25, with carefully styled hair and clothes that marked him as someone with money and education. His eyes immediately found Elena, and a smile spread across his handsome features. "Well, hello there," he said, approaching with confident strides. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Thomas Whitmore, attorney at law." He extended a manicured hand. Elena accepted the handshake briefly. "Elena Vasquez." The mysterious lady who didn't flee yesterday's excitement, Thomas said, his smile widening. How refreshing to meet someone with backbone. Morrison cleared his throat. Your supplies, Miss Vasquez. He slid the wrapped packages across the counter. As Elena counted out her coins, Thomas leaned against the counter with practiced ease.
I hope you're not seriously considering Blackwood's ridiculous proposition. A woman of obvious refinement like yourself deserves far better than that savage.
Elena's hand paused over her coin purse. What makes you so certain he's savage? Thomas laughed, but there was no warmth in it. My dear lady, the man lives like an animal in the wilderness. He's been accused of murder, he has the social graces of a wild boar, and he's clearly desperate enough to buy a wife like livestock. Surely you can see the danger in such an arrangement. And what would you suggest instead? Elena asked quietly. Thomas straightened his vest, preening slightly. A woman in your circumstances might consider other options, more civilized options. I happen to be a man of means and education, and I've been thinking it's time I settled down myself. Elena picked up her packages, meeting his gaze steadily. How kind of you to think of me as a consolation prize, Mr. Whitmore. She turned toward the door, but Thomas caught her arm gently. Wait, I didn't mean to offend. I'm simply concerned for your welfare. Elena looked down at his hand on her arm until he released her. My welfare is my own concern. Good day, gentlemen. As she stepped back into the bright morning sun, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking deeper into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple marriage of convenience. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Ilara's fingers trembled against the rough bark of the pine tree she'd backed against, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain Cade could hear it over the mountain wind. You're running from something, he said again, his voice gentler this time but no less certain. Question is whether you're running from the law or from a man. The accuracy of his guess hit her like a physical blow. She lifted her chin, forcing steel into her spine. That's none of your concern, Mr. Thorne. It is, if you're going to be my wife. The words hung in the air between them, stark and uncompromising. Elara felt the world tilt slightly, as if the mountain itself had shifted beneath her feet. I never agreed to anything. No, he acknowledged, taking a step closer. But you're still here. Every other woman in town would have run screaming by now. Perhaps I'm simply slower than the rest. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You're many things, Elara Whitmore, but slow ain't one of them. She studied his face in the dappled sunlight filtering through the pine boughs. The harsh angles seemed softer somehow, the perpetual wariness in his dark eyes replaced by something that looked almost like hope. It was that hope that terrified her more than his reputation ever could. Why me? She whispered. Because you looked at me in that general store and didn't see a monster. What did I see then? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as sandpaper, a man who's tired of being alone. The honesty in those words cut through her defenses like a blade. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she saw exactly what everyone else saw, a dangerous man who'd killed and would kill again. But it would be a lie, and she'd told enough lies to last a lifetime. I can't give you what you're looking for, she said instead. What am I looking for? Love, a real marriage, children running around your cabin. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. I'm not that kind of woman. What kind of woman are you? Broken, hunted, marked for death, the kind who brings nothing but trouble. Lady, I've been trouble since the day I was born. A little more won't kill me. She almost laughed at the irony. If only he knew how literal that statement might prove to be. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. I can't. Can't or won't. Does it matter? He considered this, his gaze never leaving her face. Reckon it doesn't. We all got secrets we ain't ready to share. The understanding in his voice nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had looked at her with such acceptance? When was the last time she'd felt anything other than fear? This arrangement, she said carefully, It would be in name only, unless you wanted otherwise. Heat flooded her cheeks at the implication. I wouldn't. Then that's settled. You'd truly be content with such a marriage? No intimacy, no promise of a future? Something flickered across his features. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. Content might be too strong a word, but I'd rather have your company than none at all. Elena closed her eyes, weighing her options. She could stay in town, continue hiding behind the persona of a refined lady seeking a quiet life. But her money wouldn't last forever, and questions would eventually arise, the kind of questions she couldn't afford to answer. Or she could disappear into the mountains with this enigmatic man who asked for nothing more than her presence. It wasn't safety. She doubted she'd ever truly be safe again, but it was a chance at something resembling peace. If I agreed, she said slowly, there would be conditions. Name them. You don't ask about my past. Not ever. Done. I keep my own room. The cabin's got 2, and if I decide to leave, I won't stop you. She opened her eyes, studying his face for any sign of deception. She found none, only that bone-deep weariness that matched her own. When? She asked. Tomorrow. Preacher comes through town once a month. He's here now. Tomorrow. The word echoed in her mind like a death knell. Or perhaps, she thought with desperate hope, like a bell tolling the start of something new. All right, she whispered. Relief flooded his features, transforming his harsh face into something almost handsome. All right, he repeated. They stood there in the mountain stillness, 2 damaged souls who'd somehow found each other in a world that had shown them little kindness. Neither spoke of love or happiness or the future. They didn't need to. Sometimes survival was enough. The morning air carried the scent of pine and frost as Elena made her way down the mountain path, her borrowed coat pulled tight against the chill. 3 days had passed since she'd agreed to Caleb's proposal, and the reality of her decision settled heavier with each step toward town. Behind her, smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, and she could still feel the weight of his watchful gaze following her descent. She'd insisted on going alone to gather her belongings from the boarding house, needing time to think without his imposing presence filling every corner of her vision. The man was like a storm cloud, impossible to ignore and equally dangerous. Yet in their brief conversations over shared meals, she'd glimpsed something else beneath that thunderous exterior. A careful politeness that suggested he'd once known gentler company. Hands that could split wood with ease but handled her chipped teacup as if it were made of gossamer. The town bustled with its usual morning activity as she approached Main Street. Shopkeepers swept their stoops while children chased each other between the wooden sidewalks, their laughter echoing off the false-fronted buildings. Elena kept her head down, hoping to avoid the curious stares that had followed her since her arrival 2 weeks ago. A stranger was always noteworthy in Cedar Ridge, but a stranger who'd agreed to marry Caleb Thorne was practically a phenomenon. Miss Hartwell! She turned to find Mrs. Patterson hurrying toward her, the older woman's face flushed with exertion and what appeared to be genuine concern. Elena forced a polite smile, though her instinct was to flee. Mrs. Patterson, good morning. Oh, my dear girl. The woman grasped Elena's hands with surprising strength. Please tell me the rumors aren't true. Surely you haven't agreed to marry that mountain devil. Elena gently extracted her hands, maintaining her composure despite the flutter of panic in her chest. Mr. Thorne has been quite respectful in his proposal. Respectful? Mrs. Patterson's voice rose an octave. Child, the man is practically a savage. He comes to town maybe twice a year, says barely 2 words to anyone, and looks ready to tear a man's throat out if he's crossed. What do you really know about him? More than you might think, Elena mused, remembering the careful way he'd banked the fire each night, ensuring she stayed warm. The way he'd left wildflowers on the table yesterday morning without a word of explanation. But she couldn't voice these observations without revealing she'd been staying at his cabin. A scandal that would destroy what little reputation she had left. I know enough, she said instead. If you'll excuse me, I have preparations to make. Mrs. Patterson caught her arm as she turned to leave. There are other options, dear. Good men in this town who would treat you proper. Don't let desperation drive you to something you'll regret. The word desperation hit closer to home than Elena cared to admit. She was desperate. Desperate to disappear, to become someone new, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the life she'd fled. Caleb's offer wasn't just marriage, it was sanctuary. Thank you for your concern, Elena said firmly, but my mind is made up. She escaped before Mrs. Patterson could protest further, making her way to the boarding house with quick, determined steps. The proprietor, Mr. Hendricks, barely looked up from his newspaper as she climbed the stairs to her small room. Her possessions were few: a worn satchel, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a faded photograph she kept hidden beneath her spare chemise, and the small derringer that had been her father's final gift. The photograph made her hands tremble as she studied the faces captured in sepia tones. A younger version of herself stood between 2 people she'd once trusted completely, before she'd learned how thoroughly trust could be betrayed, before she'd discovered what desperate people were capable of when cornered. She tucked the photograph into her bodice, close to her heart where it seemed to burn against her skin. The derringer went into her coat pocket, a precaution she prayed she'd never need, but couldn't bring herself to abandon. Some habits died harder than others. 20 minutes later, she was walking back up the mountain path, her meager belongings in hand and her future stretching ahead like an uncharted wilderness. The sun had climbed higher, warming the air and setting the autumn leaves ablaze with color. In daylight, with birdsong replacing the howl of wind through the pines, the mountain seemed less forbidding, almost beautiful. She found Caleb splitting wood behind the cabin, his powerful frame moving with rhythmic precision. He'd removed his shirt despite the cool air, and Elena found herself studying the play of muscles across his back, the long white scar that ran from his left shoulder blade toward his spine. Another story he hadn't shared, another piece of the puzzle that was her enigmatic husband-to-be. He straightened as she approached, reaching for his shirt with what might have been embarrassment. "You made good time. I travel light." She held up her small bundle. "Always have." Something flickered in his dark eyes at that admission, understanding perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Makes life simpler," he agreed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Clara made her way to the general store, her boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. 3 days had passed since Ezra's proposal, and the town buzzed with whispered speculation that followed her like smoke. She could feel their stares boring into her back, could hear the sharp intake of breath when she passed groups of women clustered near storefronts. "Morning, Miss Hartwell." Samuel Beck's voice carried a nervous tremor as she approached his store. The shopkeeper's usual jovial demeanor had been replaced by something closer to reverence mixed with pity. "Good morning, Mr. Beck." Clara kept her voice steady, refusing to acknowledge the elephant that seemed to lumber through every conversation these days. "I need supplies for preserving meat and some heavy winter fabric." His eyebrows shot up. "Planning to stay through the cold months, then?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Clara met his gaze directly. "It appears so." Beck nodded slowly, then busied himself gathering her requested items. As he worked, Clara became aware of another presence in the store. Margaret Whitmore stood near the bolts of fabric, her elegant fingers trailing over silk imported from back east. The banker's wife had perfected the art of appearing not to listen while catching every word. "Such a shame about poor Ezra," Margaret said without turning around, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "Living alone up there all these years, getting stranger by the season. They say he talks to his dead wife's ghost." Clara's hands stilled on the jar of salt she'd been examining. "Do they?" "Oh, yes." Margaret finally turned, her pale blue eyes glittering with malicious sympathy. "Sarah McKinnon was a dear friend of mine, you know. Such a tragedy when she passed. Ezra never quite recovered his faculties." The word hung between them like an accusation. Clara set down the salt jar with deliberate care. Grief affects people differently, Mrs. Whitmore. Some retreat into themselves, others find solace in spreading gossip about those who are suffering. Margaret's cheeks flushed pink above her lace collar. I hardly think caring about one's neighbours constitutes gossip, Miss Hartwell, especially when that neighbour might be making a terrible mistake. Whose mistake are you referring to? The question came from the doorway, where Ezra McKinnon's massive frame blocked most of the morning light. He stepped inside with that peculiar quiet grace Clara had noticed before, as if he'd learned to move through the world without disturbing it more than necessary. Margaret's face went white. "Mr. McKinnon, I didn't hear you come in." "Most folks don't." His grey eyes swept the store, taking in Clara's defensive posture and Margaret's obvious discomfort. "You were discussing mistakes, I believe." "I was simply expressing concern for Miss Hartwell's welfare," Margaret managed, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Ezra nodded slowly. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Whitmore, though I reckon Clara's old enough to make her own decisions about what's best for her welfare." The use of her first name sent a small thrill through Clara's chest. Such a simple thing, yet it felt like a claim, a declaration of something shifting between them. Margaret gathered her skirts with wounded dignity. "Of course. Mr. Beck, please have those items delivered to my home." She swept past Ezra without another word, though Clara caught her sharp intake of breath as she passed close to the mountain man. Samuel Beck cleared his throat nervously. "Will that be everything, Miss Hartwell?" Clara looked at her gathered supplies, then at Ezra, who stood studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Actually, Mr. Beck, could you add some coffee beans to that order? The good ones from Denver." "Planning to do some entertaining?" Beck asked, then immediately looked like he regretted the question. "Something like that." Clara's eyes met Ezra's across the store. "It's only proper to offer refreshments to one's guests." A corner of Ezra's mouth quirked upward. "Obliged, Clara. Though I should warn you, I'm particular about my coffee." "I'll keep that in mind." Beck tallied her purchases with hands that shook slightly. As Clara counted out coins, Ezra moved closer, his presence solid and warm beside her. "Walk with me?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded, leaving Beck to wrap her purchases. They stepped outside together, and she noticed how the few people on the street suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. "They're frightened of you," she observed. "Most are. Doesn't seem to bother you much." Clara considered this as they walked slowly toward the edge of town. "I've known frightening men, Ezra. You're not one of them." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "What kind of men have you known, Clara Hartwell?" The question was quiet, but she heard the steel beneath it. For a moment, the careful walls she'd built around her past threatened to crumble. Then she smiled, though it felt brittle on her lips. "The kind that taught me the difference between a man who's dangerous and a man who's simply been hurt." The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Elena stepped onto the porch, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. 3 weeks had passed since she'd agreed to Caleb's proposal, and the reality of their arrangement had settled into an unexpected rhythm. He left before dawn most days, checking his traps and hunting, while she tended to the cabin and the small garden plot behind it. She'd grown accustomed to the solitude, but today felt different. Today, they would ride into town together to speak with Reverend Morrison about the wedding ceremony. The thought sent butterflies dancing in her stomach, though she couldn't quite name whether they were born of anticipation or dread. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the tree line. Caleb emerged on his black stallion, leading a smaller chestnut mare behind him. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The man who'd been gruff and distant during their first encounter now carried himself with quiet confidence, his broad shoulders squared against the morning light. "Thought you might want to ride instead of taking the wagon," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Sage here is gentle as a lamb." Elena set down her coffee and approached the chestnut mare, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. "She's beautiful." The compliment slipped out before she could stop it, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks when Caleb's eyes met hers. "Not half as beautiful as her rider will be," he said quietly, then seemed to catch himself. I mean, that is... Thank you. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. Something had shifted between them in recent days. Small moments of kindness that felt like cracks in the wall they'd both built around their hearts. The ride to town was comfortable, filled with Caleb pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the valley. Elena found herself stealing glances at him, noting the way he sat his horse with natural ease, how his voice softened when he spoke about the land he loved. There's something you should know, Caleb said, as the town's buildings came into view. People will stare, they'll whisper. Most folks in Willowbrook have never seen me with a woman, never thought I'd... Settle down? Elena supplied. Deserve to, he corrected, his jaw tightening. I've done things, Elena, in the war after it, things that good people don't forget. Elena guided her mare closer to his stallion, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched. We all have shadows, Caleb. The question is whether we let them define us or choose to step into the light. His dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her heart race. And what shadows are you running from? The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Elena's fingers tightened on the reins as memories threatened to surface. The sound of breaking glass, the smell of smoke, the weight of decisions that had changed everything. Perhaps someday I'll tell you, she said finally, when I'm brave enough. They reached the church as the morning service was ending. Parishioners filed out, their conversations dying as they spotted the unlikely pair. Elena lifted her chin, meeting their curious stares with quiet dignity. She'd faced worse than small-town gossip. Reverend Morrison was a kind man with silver hair and warm eyes. He welcomed them into his study, barely blinking at Caleb's intimidating presence. Marriage is a sacred covenant, the Reverend said, after they'd explained their situation. Not to be entered into lightly, even under practical circumstances. We understand, Elena said, though she wondered if either of them truly did. I'll need to post the bans for 3 weeks, unless there are pressing circumstances. There are, Caleb said grimly. The territorial judge arrives next month. If I'm not married by then... Reverend Morrison nodded, understanding. Very well, Saturday next then. Simple ceremony? Elena glanced at Caleb, who was staring at his hands. Simple is perfect. As they prepared to leave, the Reverend placed a gentle hand on Elena's arm. Child, marriage has a way of revealing who we truly are, both the light and the darkness. Are you prepared for that? Elena thought of the secrets locked away in her heart, the reasons she'd fled Colorado with nothing but the clothes on her back. I hope so, Reverend. I truly hope so. Outside the church, Caleb helped her mount Sage, his hands lingering on her waist longer than necessary. Having second thoughts? He asked. Elena looked down at him, this man who'd shown her more kindness in 3 weeks than she'd known in years. No, she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Are you? Every day, he admitted. But not about you. As they rode home through the golden afternoon light, Elena felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing against her chest. 7 days until they spoke vows that would bind them together. 7 days to decide whether love could bloom from the ashes of 2 broken lives. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin as Elena stirred flour into a bowl, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. 3 days had passed since Silas had kissed her in the meadow, 3 days of stolen glances and careful distance. She could feel him watching her now from where he sat mending a bridle near the window, his presence both comforting and unsettling. A sharp knock at the door shattered the quiet morning routine. Elena's spoon clattered against the bowl as Silas rose swiftly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle mounted above the mantel. Visitors were rare at the mountain cabin, and unexpected ones usually meant trouble. Silas MacCready, the voice boomed from outside, official and demanding. This is Marshal Davidson. Open up! Elena's blood turned to ice. Her past had found her. It had to be. She pressed herself against the kitchen wall, fighting the urge to flee out the back door. Silas glanced at her, noting her pale complexion, before moving to answer the door. Marshal Davidson stood on the porch flanked by 2 deputies, his badge glinting in the morning light. He was a tall man with graying temples and eyes that missed nothing. Behind him, Elena caught sight of another figure that made her stomach lurch. A well-dressed man in an expensive coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat brim. "Marshal," Silas said evenly, blocking the doorway with his considerable frame. "What brings you up the mountain?" "Official business, McCready. We're looking for someone." Davidson's gaze moved past Silas toward the dim interior of the cabin. "A woman. Goes by several names, but we have reason to believe she might be in these parts." "Lot of women in the territory," Silas replied, his voice carefully neutral. "You'll have to be more specific." The well-dressed man stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal a face Elena recognized with dawning horror. Charles Whitmore, her former employer's son, the man whose advances she'd rejected, whose lies had forced her to flee Boston in the dead of night. "Perhaps I can assist," Charles said smoothly, his cultured accent sharp against the mountain air. "The woman we seek is approximately 25 years of age, dark hair, green eyes. She's wanted in connection with a theft in Boston. Quite valuable jewelry, I'm afraid." Elena's hands clenched into fists. The theft he spoke of was fabricated, revenge for her refusal to become his mistress. She'd taken nothing but her own meager possessions when she'd fled, but Charles had the money and influence to make any lie seem like truth. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description," Silas said, but Elena heard the slight change in his tone. He was putting pieces together, remembering her reaction to questions about her past. "Mind if we take a look around?" Marshal Davidson asked, though it wasn't really a question. "We have a warrant." Silas stepped aside reluctantly. Elena knew she had moments before they spotted her in the kitchen alcove. Her mind raced through possibilities, the root cellar, the loft, the dense woods behind the cabin. But running would only confirm their suspicions and implicate Silas as an accomplice. Instead, she smoothed her apron, lifted her chin, and stepped into view. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said quietly, proud that her voice remained steady. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're looking for someone?" Charles's eyes lit with triumph, but she noticed how he stayed safely behind the marshal. "There she is! That's her! That's Evangeline Hartford, the thief!" Elena felt Silas's sharp gaze on her face, saw the moment when hurt flickered across his features. Not because he believed the accusation, but because he realized how much she'd hidden from him. "My name is Elena Winters," she said firmly. "I don't know what this man is talking about." Elena Winters, Evangeline Hartford, Catherine Mills. Charles counted off on his manicured fingers. "How many names do you use, my dear? And how many wealthy households have you robbed?" "That's enough," Silas growled, moving to stand beside Elena. The protective gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. "You're talking about my wife?" Marshal Davidson raised an eyebrow. "Your wife? When did this marriage take place, Macready?" 2 weeks ago, Silas lied smoothly. "Father Miguel performed the ceremony down in Pine Ridge. You can check the church records." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. He was risking everything for her, his reputation, his standing in the community, possibly even his freedom. The weight of his faith in her was both humbling and terrifying. Charles's face flushed with anger. "She's a criminal, a thief and a—" "Careful," Silas interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "You're talking about my wife." The marshal studied them both carefully, his experienced eyes noting the protective stance Silas had taken and the way Elena unconsciously moved closer to the mountain man's solid presence. "We'll need to discuss this further," Davidson said finally. "All of us." The storm that had threatened all week finally broke on a Tuesday morning, sending sheets of rain against the cabin windows and turning the mountain paths into treacherous rivers of mud. Elena stood at the kitchen window, watching the lightning split the grey sky, her fingers unconsciously tracing the scar along her wrist, a habit that surfaced whenever her past pressed too close. Behind her, Marcus moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire and checking the supplies. 3 weeks of marriage had settled them into an easy rhythm, though neither spoke of the careful distance they still maintained. He slept on the floor by the hearth while she took the bed, and they moved around each other like dancers who knew the steps but had never quite learned to touch. "Creeks rising fast," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the sound of rain. "We'll be cut off from town for a few days." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Being trapped here with him should have felt claustrophobic, but instead she found herself fighting an unexpected sense of relief. No visitors, no chance encounters, no risk of someone recognizing her face from a wanted poster or a newspaper sketch. The thunder rolled overhead, and she jumped despite herself. Marcus was beside her in an instant, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. "Just a storm," he said softly. "These mountains know how to howl, but the cabin's solid." She turned to face him, struck by how his presence had become her anchor in ways she hadn't expected. "I'm not afraid of storms." "No," he agreed, his grey eyes searching her face. "I don't think you're afraid of much that you should be afraid of." The implication hung between them, that she feared other things, deeper things. Elena stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "I should check the root cellar, make sure nothing's flooding." But Marcus caught her wrist gently, his thumb brushing over the scar she'd been tracing. She froze, realizing he'd noticed her habit, had probably been watching her do it for weeks. "Elena," his voice was rough with something she couldn't name, "whatever you're running from, I'm not running." The lie came automatically, but even as she said it, she knew he wouldn't believe it. "You flinch every time someone rides up the path. You never mention family, friends, anywhere you've been before Silver Creek. And sometimes you look at me like you're memorizing my face before you have to disappear." Her breath caught. He saw too much, understood too much. It was what drew her to him and what terrified her in equal measure. "Would it matter?" she whispered. "If I was running from something terrible?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his thumb still tracing gentle circles over her scarred wrist. "Depends on what terrible means to you." Before she could answer, a sharp crack of thunder made them both look toward the window. In the lightning's flash, Elena saw riders approaching through the rain, 3 men in dark coats, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. The blood drained from her face. She knew that purposeful way of riding, the formation that spoke of men accustomed to hunting other men, bounty hunters or worse, agents sent by people who had very good reasons to want her found. "Elena?" Marcus had noticed her sudden stillness. "Don't answer the door," she said urgently, backing away from the window. "Please, Marcus, don't let them see me." His expression hardened instantly, and she realized she'd just confirmed every suspicion he'd harbored about her past. But instead of demanding answers, he moved to the gun rack by the door. "Get in the back room," he said quietly. "Stay away from the windows." The riders were closer now, and Elena could see they weren't here for shelter from the storm. They moved with the deliberate caution of men who expected trouble, their hands resting on their weapons. "Marcus," she started, but he cut her off. "Whatever you've done, whoever they are, it doesn't matter right now." His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "This is my land, my wife, my home. No one rides up here in a storm with ill intent." "My wife." The words shouldn't have sent warmth through her chest at such a moment, but they did. For weeks, she'd felt like a guest in his life, a temporary arrangement that would dissolve when convenience demanded. But the way he said it now, with such fierce protectiveness, made something crack open inside her chest. A heavy knock echoed through the cabin, followed by a voice that made Elena's knees nearly buckle. "Open up. We're looking for a woman, Elena Vasquez. We know she's here." Marcus looked back at her, and she saw the exact moment he understood that whatever she was running from had finally caught up. But instead of fear or betrayal in his eyes, she saw something that made her breath stop entirely. She saw a man preparing to fight for her. The morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Elena stirred in Caleb's arms, her breath catching as memories of the previous night flooded back. His confession about his scars, her own half-whispered secrets in the darkness. They had crossed a threshold neither could retreat from. Caleb was already awake, she realized, his chest rising and falling beneath her cheek in a rhythm too deliberate for sleep. His hand moved slowly through her hair, gentle as a man handling spun glass. "I can hear you thinking," she murmured against his skin. A rumble of laughter vibrated through his chest. "Can you now?" She lifted her head to meet his gaze, finding those storm-grey eyes already studying her face with an intensity that made her heart skip. In the morning light, the harsh planes of his features seemed softer somehow. The deep scar across his jaw, just another part of the man she was falling dangerously close to loving. "What troubles you?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. Caleb's hand stilled in her hair. "Nothing troubles me. That's what I can't figure." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "For the first time in years, Elena, I woke up and nothing hurt." The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. She pressed her forehead to his, breathing in the scent of pine and leather that clung to his skin. "Perhaps that's what peace feels like. Is it what you feel? Peace?" The question hung between them like a blade. Elena closed her eyes, knowing she should tell him the truth about Thomas, about why she'd really come to Pine Ridge, about the danger that might follow her here. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by the fear of losing this fragile thing growing between them. "Yes," she whispered, and it wasn't entirely a lie. In his arms, she did feel peace, the first she'd known in months. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Caleb went rigid beneath her, his entire body shifting into the alertness of a predator. Elena felt him reach for the rifle that never left his side. "Caleb McKinnon." The voice outside was gravelly, unfamiliar. "Need to talk to you." Elena started to sit up, but Caleb's arm tightened around her. "Stay down," he murmured, his voice barely audible. In one fluid motion, he slipped from the bed and pulled on his trousers, rifle in hand. "Who's asking?" Caleb called back, positioning himself beside the window where he could see out without being seen. "Marshal Davis, from Silver Creek. Got some questions about a wanted fugitive." Elena's blood turned to ice. She clutched the blanket to her chest, her mind racing. Thomas had found her. Somehow, despite all her precautions, he'd tracked her here. Her hands shook as she reached for her dress. Caleb glanced back at her, and she saw the exact moment he noticed her terror. His expression hardened, but not with anger, with deadly protectiveness. "What fugitive?" Caleb called out, buying time as Elena dressed with fumbling fingers. "Woman named Elena Whitmore. Goes by Elena Morrison now. Dark hair, green eyes, about so tall, wanted for theft and murder back east." The words hit Elena like physical blows. Murder. Thomas had actually accused her of murder. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Caleb moved to her side in 2 quick strides. "Is it true?" he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "No," she breathed. "I mean, the theft, yes, but it was my own money. And I never killed anyone, Caleb, I swear to you." Something in her face must have convinced him, because he nodded once, decisively. "Back door," he murmured. "Take the horse, head for the high caves. You remember the path I showed you?" "I can't run anymore," she whispered, suddenly exhausted by the thought of it. "I'm tired of running." "Then we don't run." Caleb's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "We fight." Before she could protest, he strode to the door. "Marshal, you got papers?" "Course I got papers." "Open up. Slide them under the door. Man in my position can't be too careful about who claims to be the law." Elena watched as a folded document appeared beneath the door. Caleb examined it carefully, and she saw his jaw tighten. "Looks official enough," he called out, "but I haven't seen any woman matching that description." "That's so? Because word in town is you just got yourself married to a woman fits that bill exactly." Caleb met Elena's eyes across the room. In his gaze, she saw not condemnation or fear, but a fierce determination that took her breath away. This mountain man, this supposed monster that the whole town feared, was preparing to lie to a federal marshal for her. "Then word in town is wrong," Caleb said loudly. "My wife's been here near 2 years now. born and raised in Pine Ridge. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain air crisp and electric. Clara stood at the cabin window, watching Ezra split wood in the yard below, his movements precise and powerful despite the tension she could see in his shoulders. 3 days had passed since their confrontation about her past, and though he'd said they would face whatever came together, she felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing between them like a physical thing. She touched the letter hidden in her apron pocket, the one that had arrived yesterday while Ezra was checking the trap lines. The familiar handwriting made her blood run cold, but it was the postmark that truly terrified her. Denver. He was getting closer. Clara! Ezra's voice from the doorway made her spin around, guilt written across her features before she could mask it. His dark eyes missed nothing, and she watched his expression shift from concern to something harder. "There's something you're not telling me," he said, stepping into the cabin and closing the door behind him. Snow dusted his shoulders and caught in his dark hair. "I can see it eating at you." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth from the fireplace. "Ezra, No more half-truths." His voice was gentle but firm as he crossed to her, his calloused hands framing her face. "I meant what I said about facing this together, but I can't fight shadows. Tell me what's got you jumping at every sound, what's got you staring at the horizon like you're expecting the devil himself to come riding up that mountain." The tenderness in his touch nearly broke her resolve. This man who'd been betrayed and abandoned before was offering her his complete trust, and she was repaying it with lies. The irony cut deep. "His name is Marcus Blackwood," she whispered, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "And he's not just any lawman. He's a federal marshal, and he's my husband." She felt Ezra's hand still against her cheeks, watched the color drain from his face. But he didn't pull away, didn't step back in disgust or rage as she'd feared. Instead, his thumbs traced gentle circles on her skin. "Legal husband?" he asked quietly. "Yes." The admission tasted like ashes. "I was 17, desperate, alone on the streets of Chicago after my parents died. He was handsome, charming, promised to take care of me." She laughed bitterly. "I thought I was so lucky that a man like him would want someone like me." Ezra's jaw tightened, but his touch remained gentle. "What did he do to you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the terrible possibilities. Clara closed her eyes, drawing strength from his steady presence. "At first, nothing. He was the perfect gentleman, the perfect husband, but after a few months when he was sure I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to—" She took a shuddering breath. "He liked control, liked to remind me that I owed him everything, that without him I'd be nothing. When words weren't enough, he used his fists." She felt Ezra's muscles coil with barely contained violence, heard the low growl that rumbled in his chest. When she opened her eyes, his face was a mask of controlled fury, not at her, she realized with wonder, but for her. "How did you get away?" "I killed a man." The words came out flat, matter of fact. "One of Marcus's associates. He tried to—" She swallowed hard. "Marcus had offered me to him as payment for some favor when I fought back. When I grabbed the letter opener from the desk and drove it into his throat, Marcus saw an opportunity. He could have me arrested for murder, or I could disappear and he could claim I'd died in a tragic accident. Collect on my life insurance, play the grieving widower. But you're still legally his wife," Ezra said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Which means our marriage isn't legal, I know." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Ezra. I never meant for it to go this far, never meant to drag you into this mess. But then I fell in love with you, and I was selfish enough to want to pretend, just for a little while, that I could have something good." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and Clara's quiet sobs. Then Ezra pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her like a fortress. "How close is he?" he asked against her hair. She pulled the letter from her pocket with trembling fingers. "Denver, this came yesterday." Ezra took the letter, scanning its contents quickly. His expression grew grimmer with each line. When he finished, he looked down at her with eyes that blazed with determination. "Then we don't have much time," he said simply. "But Clara, hear me clearly. I don't care about papers or laws or what some judge says about our marriage. You're mine, and I'm yours, and no man is taking you from this mountain." The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Elena packed her few belongings into the worn leather satchel. Her hands trembled as she folded the blue dress Caleb had bought her in town, the one he said matched her eyes. Each item felt heavy with the weight of what she was leaving behind. Caleb had ridden out early to check the northern boundary, giving her the perfect opportunity to slip away. She'd memorized his routines over the past weeks, knowing this moment would come. It always did. Running was what she did best, what kept her alive, what kept others safe from the darkness that followed her. The letter lay on the kitchen table, her explanation written in careful script. She'd started it a dozen times, each attempt falling short of expressing the tangle of love and terror in her chest. How could she make him understand that leaving him was the only way to protect him? "Dearest Caleb," it began. "But by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Please don't follow me. What we had was beautiful, but some things are too broken to be fixed. You deserve a woman who can give you peace, not one who brings storms. The land will be yours. Our marriage papers are in the wooden box beneath the bed. Thank you for showing me what love could feel like, even if I can't keep it." She'd signed it simply Elena, though even that name felt like another lie added to the collection. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Too early. Caleb wasn't supposed to return for hours. Elena grabbed the satchel and bolted for the back door, but the footsteps on the front porch weren't Caleb's heavy boots. They were lighter, more cautious. "Mrs. Reed," a woman's voice called, "are you home?" Elena recognized Sarah Mitchell, the pastor's wife, through the window. Relief and frustration warred in her chest as she opened the door, hiding the satchel behind her skirts. "Sarah, what brings you out here?" The older woman's face was flushed from riding, her usually perfect hair disheveled. "I had to warn you. There are men in town asking questions. Federal marshals by the look of them. They're showing around a sketch of a woman, offering a reward." The blood drained from Elena's face. "What kind of questions?" "About a woman traveling alone, maybe with dark hair. They said she's wanted in connection with some trouble back east." Sarah's eyes were kind but knowing. "Elena, I don't know what you're running from, but these men, they're not giving up. They're planning to search every homestead within 50 miles. Elena's carefully constructed world crumbled. She'd been a fool to think she could outrun her past forever, that love could somehow shield her from the consequences of what she'd done. The satchel felt impossibly heavy in her grip. "How long do I have?" "They're starting tomorrow at dawn, working their way out from town. This place will likely be last on their list because of Caleb's reputation, but—" Sarah reached out and squeezed Elena's arm. "Whatever you did, whatever you're running from, you don't have to face it alone. Caleb loves you. The whole town can see it." "That's exactly why I have to go." Elena's voice cracked. "He'll try to protect me and they'll destroy him for it. I won't let that happen. You're stronger than you think, child. And sometimes the thing we're most afraid of losing is worth fighting for." After Sarah left, Elena sank into the chair where Caleb usually sat, surrounded by the life they'd built together. The quilt she'd mended draped over the back, the books he'd been teaching her to read stacked on the side table, the coffee cup still bearing the imprint of his lips from breakfast. She thought of the night before, how he'd held her as thunder rolled across the mountains, whispering that nothing would ever hurt her while he drew breath. How could she tell him that the danger came not from outside, but from her own past, that the man she'd killed in self-defense had been a senator's son, and justice for people like her was rarely found in courtrooms? The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her heart racing again. This time she recognized the familiar rhythm of Caleb's horse. She barely had time to shove the letter into her pocket before he appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space. "You're home early," she managed, forcing a smile. "Missed you too much to stay away," he said, but his eyes were sharp, taking in details she hoped weren't visible. "Everything all right? You look pale." Elena stood and walked into his arms, breathing in his scent of pine and leather and something uniquely him. For a moment she let herself imagine telling him everything, fighting together against whatever came. But the image of him broken and defeated, stripped of everything he'd worked for, shattered the fantasy. Just tired, she lied against his chest, memorizing the steady beat of his heart. "Hold me." His arms tightened around her, and Elena closed her eyes, counting each precious second before the storm arrived. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. Eliza's blood turned to ice as she recognized the rhythm. 3 riders, moving with purpose, not the casual gait of travelers. She pressed herself against the cabin window, watching as dust clouds rose in the distance. "Jebediah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He emerged from the barn, his massive frame tense with alertness. Even from this distance, she could see the way his hand instinctively moved toward the rifle leaning against the doorframe. He'd sensed what she had. These weren't friendly visitors. The riders crested the hill, and Eliza's worst fears materialized before her eyes. 3 men in dark coats, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. The leader sat his horse with an arrogance she remembered all too well. Marcus Thornfield had found her. Her hands shook as she backed away from the window. 6 months of peace, 6 months of believing she might have escaped, crumbled in an instant. The life she'd built here with Jebediah, fragile as morning frost, was about to shatter. Outside she heard Jebediah's voice, low and dangerous. "State your business." "We're looking for someone," Marcus called back, his cultured eastern accent cutting through the mountain air. "A woman. Dark hair, green eyes. Goes by several names, but we knew her as Elizabeth Carruthers." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Eliza closed her eyes, knowing Jebediah was processing this information, connecting pieces she'd never given him. Elizabeth Carruthers, the name of the woman who'd testified against Marcus's criminal empire, who'd sent half his organization to prison before disappearing into the night. "Don't know anyone by that name," Jebediah replied, his tone neutral but carrying an undertone that made Eliza shiver. "Perhaps you know her by another name. Eliza, maybe?" Marcus's voice held cruel amusement. "She has a talent for reinvention, also a talent for betrayal." Through the window, Eliza watched her husband's shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly. The only sign that Marcus's words had struck home. "My wife's name is Eliza," Jebediah said slowly, "but she's never been back east." "Your wife?" Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. How delightfully domestic. "Tell me, mountain man, did she mention the $20,000 she stole from me, or the men who died because of her testimony?" Eliza's breath caught. $20,000. She'd forgotten about the money she'd taken from Marcus's safe the night she fled, evidence of his crimes that she'd turned over to the authorities along with her testimony. Blood money from extortion, murder, and worse. "She's not here," Jebediah said. "Now, we both know that's not true." Marcus dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate precision. "Elizabeth always did have a weakness for damaged men. Strays. Though I must say, this is quite the downgrade from her usual taste." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire. Eliza saw Jebediah's hand inch closer to his rifle, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Marcus had 2 men with him, both armed, both killers. Jebediah was skilled, but these weren't mountain cats or claim jumpers. These were professionals. "I'll ask you once more to leave my land," Jebediah said, his voice dropping to the deadly quiet tone Eliza had heard him use with bears. "Gladly, as soon as Elizabeth comes out for a little chat." Marcus pulled off his gloves with theatrical precision. "She owes me a debt, you understand, the kind that can only be paid in blood." That was when Eliza made her choice. She'd run once before, leaving destruction in her wake. She'd let Marcus's reach extend across a continent to poison the one pure thing she'd found. but she wouldn't let Jebediah die for her sins. She stepped out of the cabin, her chin raised despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Hello, Marcus." All four men turned toward her. Jebediah's face went white beneath his beard, while Marcus smiled like a wolf scenting wounded prey. "There she is," Marcus purred. "My dear Elizabeth, you've been quite difficult to find." "It's Eliza now," she said, moving to stand beside her husband. "And this is my home." Jebediah's eyes never left the three men, but she felt the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Get back inside," he murmured. "No." She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the coiled muscle beneath his sleeve. "This is my fight, Jebediah. It always was." Marcus's smile widened. "How touching. Though I'm afraid domestic bliss won't save you from what you owe me, dear Elizabeth. You destroyed my business, my reputation, my freedom. 20 men went to prison because of you. 20 men who deserved worse," Eliza shot back. "Perhaps, but justice, as I've learned, is a luxury purchased with power, and I've rebuilt mine." His eyes glittered with malevolent pleasure. "The question now is whether your mountain man dies quickly or slowly when he tries to protect you." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat from hard travel. Elena watched from the kitchen window as Marcus emerged from the barn, his face darkening as he recognized the official seal. Her blood turned to ice when she saw him tear it open, his jaw clenching with each line he read. She met him at the door, studying the storm brewing in his eyes. "What is it?" "Judge Morrison's dead." His voice was granite. "Heart gave out 3 days ago. The new judge is reviewing all his recent decisions." He held up the letter, his knuckles white. "Including our marriage certificate." The words hit her like a physical blow. "They can't. They can do whatever they damn well please." Marcus crumpled the paper, his control fracturing. "Says here Judge Morrison was drinking heavy toward the end, making questionable rulings. They're questioning the validity of marriages performed in his final months." Elena sank into a chair, her mind racing. Without their marriage, Marcus would lose everything. The land that had been in his family for generations, the home they'd built together, the future they dared to imagine. "How long do we have?" "Hearing set for next week. We need to prove our marriage was legitimate, conducted properly." His laugh was bitter, as if standing before God and man wasn't enough. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, pacing like a caged wolf. "Marcus, we'll fight this. There has to be—" "Fight with what?" He whirled to face her. "You think they don't know exactly what this was? A desperate mountain man and a woman with no past, married in haste to save some land? They'll tear us apart in that courtroom." The accusation in his voice cut deep, but Elena recognized the fear beneath his anger. Fear of losing everything again, of being abandoned like he had been so many times before. She stood slowly, her own resolve hardening. "Is that what you think this is? Still?" Something in her tone made him stop pacing. She moved closer, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "You want the truth about my past? The real reason I ran?" She didn't wait for his answer. "My name wasn't Elena Crawford. It was Elena Ashford. My husband was Senator William Ashford." Marcus went very still. "He was a monster," she continued, the words coming easier now that they were finally free. "Beat me, controlled every breath I took, every word I spoke. But he was careful, charming in public. No one would have believed me." Her voice cracked. "I tried to leave twice. Both times he found me, brought me back. The second time he nearly killed me." Marcus reached for her, but she stepped back, needing to finish. "The night I finally escaped, I took some of his documents. Insurance, I thought. Evidence of his corruption, his deals with railroad barons, his bribes. I've been carrying them ever since, terrified he'd find me." She met his eyes. "That's why I couldn't tell you. That's why I was so afraid." The silence stretched between them, heavy with revelation. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Elena, I know you're scared," she whispered. "I know you think I'll leave when things get hard. But I'm done running, Marcus. This is my home. You're my home." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her against his chest. She felt his heart hammering, felt the tremor in his hands as he held her. "I'm sorry," he breathed against her hair. "God, Elena, I'm so sorry. The things I said, you were protecting yourself. I understand." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes fierce. "No more. No more protecting myself at your expense. We face this together." She nodded, then hesitated. "Marcus, those documents I mentioned, they might be worth something, to the right people. If we need money for lawyers or—" "No." His voice was firm. "We don't fight corruption with more corruption. We do this clean or not at all." Despite everything, she smiled. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who chose honor even when it cost him everything. "Then we find another way," she said. "We have a week to gather witnesses, to prove our marriage was real and legitimate. Mrs. Henderson was there, and Dr. Bailey. Half the town saw us afterward." Marcus nodded slowly, hope flickering in his eyes. "Sarah Johnson, too. She helped with your dress." "We can do this," Elena said, meaning it. "Whatever comes, we face it together." He kissed her then, deep and desperate, pouring all his fear and love and determination into the connection between them. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. Together, he agreed, and for the first time since the letter arrived, Elena believed they might actually win. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke as evening fell, sending sheets of rain against the cabin windows with violent force. Elena pressed her face to the glass, watching the lightning illuminate the mountains in stark, terrifying beauty. Each flash reminded her of the gunfire from her nightmares, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Behind her, Marcus moved quietly through their home, banking the fire and checking the door latches. The domesticity of it should have comforted her, but tonight every shadow seemed to hide a threat. She'd been on edge for days, ever since receiving the telegram that lay crumpled in the bottom of her trunk upstairs. "Come away from the window," Marcus said softly, his large hands settling on her shoulders. "The storm will pass." If only he knew it wasn't the weather that frightened her. Elena leaned back against his solid chest, drawing strength from his presence. How could she tell him that their peaceful life was about to shatter? That the past she'd tried so desperately to bury was clawing its way to the surface? "Marcus," she began, then stopped. The words stuck in her throat like broken glass. He turned her in his arms, his dark eyes searching her face. "You've been troubled for days. What is it?" The concern in his voice nearly broke her resolve. This man who had once been called a monster by every soul in town now looked at her with such tenderness that it made her chest ache. He'd given her everything, his heart, his home, his trust, and she was about to destroy it all. Thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the cabin's foundation. In the distance, she could hear the worried lowing of cattle and the sharp bark of the dogs. Marcus glanced toward the door, his jaw tightening. "I should check on the animals," he said reluctantly. "Don't go." The words escaped before she could stop them, sharp with panic. He stilled, studying her face in the flickering firelight. "Elena, what's wrong? You're white as snow." She opened her mouth to tell him everything. About Chicago, about the man who'd sworn to find her, about the telegram that promised he was coming. But before she could speak, a sound cut through the storm that made her blood turn to ice. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. Marcus heard them too. His entire body went rigid, and she watched as the gentle husband disappeared, replaced by the dangerous mountain man who'd once made grown men cross the street to avoid him. He moved to the gun rack with fluid grace, pulling down his rifle and checking the load. "Get upstairs," he commanded, his voice hard as granite. "Stay away from the windows. Marcus, now. Elena." The authority in his tone brooked no argument, but she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because she recognized the rhythm of those hoofbeats, the particular way the lead horse favored his left front leg. She'd heard that sound in her nightmares for months. The riders stopped outside their cabin. Through the rain she could hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather as men dismounted. Marcus positioned himself beside the door, rifle ready, his face a mask of deadly calm. "Open up, McKenna," a voice called through the storm. "We're not here for you." Elena's knees nearly buckled. That voice, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, belonged to Vincent Carrera, the man who'd once owned her completely. The man she'd thought she'd escaped forever. Marcus's eyes never left the door, but she saw his jaw clench at the use of his surname. "State your business or ride on. I don't take kindly to visitors in weather like this. We're looking for someone, a woman. Goes by Elena Walsh now, though that's not her real name." Vincent's laughter carried through the wind, cold and mocking. "I believe you know her quite well." The rifle in Marcus's hands didn't waver, but Elena saw something die in his eyes. He turned to look at her, and the betrayal she saw there cut deeper than any blade ever could. "Elena Walsh," he said quietly, as if testing the name. "Is that even your real name? Marcus, please, let me explain." "Is it?" The question cracked like a whip. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling smaller than she had since arriving in this mountain town. "No, it's not." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm's fury and the restless movement of horses outside. Marcus's face had gone completely blank, that terrifying emptiness she remembered from their first meeting. "McKenna," Vincent called again. "Send her out and we'll be on our way. No trouble for you or your town." "No," Marcus said, so quietly she almost missed it. "What?" He looked at her one more time, and despite everything, the lies, the deception, the danger she'd brought to his door, she saw love there. Wounded and angry, but love nonetheless. "I said no," Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly through the storm. "She stays." The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Elena saddled her horse with trembling fingers. Each movement felt deliberate, final, as if she were preparing for a journey from which there would be no return. In her saddlebags she'd packed only the essentials, enough food for 3 days, her mother's silver locket, and the letter she'd written to Marcus in the sleepless hours before dawn. Behind her the cabin remained silent. Marcus had left before sunrise to check the northern fence line, unaware that his wife was preparing to vanish from his life as suddenly as she'd entered it. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come to this valley running from her past, only to find herself running again. This time from the only future she'd ever wanted. The letter lay propped against the coffee pot on the kitchen table, her careful script explaining what she couldn't bear to say face to face. By the time he returned, she would be miles away, heading toward the territorial border and whatever uncertain fate awaited her there. As she led her horse toward the trail, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. Through the morning mist, she could see a lone rider cresting the hill, not Marcus returning early, but Sheriff Davidson, his badge catching the first rays of sunlight. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the purposeful set of his shoulders, the grim determination in his posture. "Mrs. Thorne?" he called out as he drew near, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Planning a little trip?" Elena's mind raced, calculating distances, escape routes, the slim chances of outrunning a man who knew every trail in the territory. "Just going to town for supplies," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Davidson's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. "I don't think so, ma'am. You see, I've been corresponding with some colleagues back east. Interesting thing about wanted posters. They have a way of catching up with folks no matter how far they run." The words hit her like physical blows. After all this time, all the careful distance she'd put between herself and that terrible night in Chicago, the past had finally found her. She thought of Marcus, probably whistling as he rode the fence line, blissfully unaware that his wife was about to be dragged away in chains. "There's been a mistake," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was useless. Davidson's eyes held the satisfaction of a man who'd solved a puzzle that had been nagging at him for months. "Elena Vasquez," he said, pronouncing each syllable with careful precision. "Wanted in connection with the death of Theodore Blackwell, prominent businessman. Chicago police have been looking for you for quite some time." The name dropped between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples of memory crashing through her carefully constructed defenses. Theodore Blackwell, the man who'd owned the factory where she'd worked, who'd cornered her in his office that night, who'd tried to force himself on her with whiskey-sour breath and grasping hands, the man whose head had struck the corner of his desk when she'd pushed him away in desperation. "It wasn't murder," she whispered, the words torn from some deep place inside her. I was defending myself." "That's for a jury to decide," Davidson replied, swinging down from his saddle. "The warrant says you fled the scene, disappeared without a trace. Funny how guilty consciences make people run." Elena's horse shifted restlessly beneath her, sensing her distress. For a wild moment she considered spurring the animal into a gallop, racing toward the tree line where the thick pines might offer concealment. But she was trapped between her past and her present, between the life she'd built with Marcus and the violence that had driven her here. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her voice. "My husband, he doesn't know. Can I at least wait until he returns, explain?" "I'm afraid not, ma'am. I have a duty to uphold the law, and that means bringing you in before you can disappear again." Davidson pulled out a pair of iron shackles, their metallic clink sounding like a death knell in the morning air. As the cold metal closed around her wrists, Elena closed her eyes and thought of Marcus's hands, so different from these restraints, gentle and sure, calloused from honest work rather than violence. She thought of his smile when he looked at her across the breakfast table, the way he murmured her name in his sleep, the careful tenderness with which he'd helped her heal from wounds he'd never fully understood. The sheriff helped her down from her horse, his grip firm but not unkind. As they prepared to leave, Elena cast one last look at the cabin that had been her sanctuary, at the life she'd built from nothing but hope and desperate love. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in the shadow of the mountains. The dawn light filtered through the cabin windows as Sarah packed the last of her belongings into the worn leather satchel. Her hands trembled as she folded the blue dress Marcus had bought her in town, the one he said matched her eyes. Each item felt like another piece of her heart being torn away, but she couldn't stay, not after what she'd learned. Marcus stirred in the bed behind her, and she froze, praying he wouldn't wake. Not yet. She needed more time to find the courage to face him, to explain why she had to leave before the sun climbed much higher. "Going somewhere." His voice was rough with sleep, but she could hear the wariness creeping in. Sarah's shoulders sagged. She'd been foolish to think she could slip away unnoticed. Marcus noticed everything. It was what had kept him alive in these mountains for so long. "I have to go." The words came out as barely a whisper. She heard the rustle of bedsheets, then his bare feet hitting the wooden floor. "Look at me, Sarah." Slowly she turned to face the man she'd come to love more than her own life. His dark hair was disheveled, his chest bare, and those piercing grey eyes that had once terrified her now held a pain that cut straight through her soul. Why? The single word carried the weight of everything they'd built together. Sarah's resolve wavered. How could she explain that her past had finally caught up with them? That the letter tucked in her bodice contained news that would destroy not just her, but him as well? "The man I was married to," she began, her voice barely audible. "He's not dead." Marcus went perfectly still, that dangerous stillness she'd witnessed only when he was preparing for violence. "Explain." "I received word yesterday, from a lawyer in Denver." Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out the crumpled envelope. "Thomas survived the fire. He's been looking for me." "And you were planning to just run?" Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. "Without telling me, without giving me a chance to protect you?" "You don't understand." Tears began streaming down her face. "He's not just any man, Marcus. He's powerful, connected. He has influence with judges, with law enforcement, and he's—" She swallowed hard. "He's claiming I tried to murder him, that I set that fire deliberately." Marcus crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his hands gripping her shoulders. Did you? The question hung between them like a blade. Sarah met his gaze steadily, seeing her own reflection in those storm-grey eyes. Would it matter? Answer me. Yes, the word came out stronger than she'd expected. I did. He was going to sell my sister to pay his gambling debts. She was only 14, Marcus. I couldn't let him destroy her the way he'd destroyed me. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, but it wasn't the disgust or horror she'd expected. Instead, she saw a fierce protectiveness that made her heart ache. Then you did what needed doing. His thumbs brushed away her tears. And you think I'm going to let him take you back to face some trumped-up murder charge? You don't have a choice. He's coming here, Marcus, with federal marshals. The letter says they'll be here within the week. Marcus released her and began pacing, his mind clearly racing. We'll go deeper into the mountains. I know places where no lawman would dare follow. For how long? A year? 2? The rest of our lives? Sarah shook her head. That's not living, Marcus. That's just surviving, and you've done enough of that for one lifetime. Then what do you suggest? The pain in his voice nearly broke her resolve. I go back with them. I face whatever comes. Maybe if I cooperate, they'll show leniency. Like hell. Marcus's voice turned savage. You think I'd let you walk into that man's trap after everything he's done to you? It's not your choice to make. The hell it isn't. You're my wife. A marriage that might not even be legal if my first husband is still alive. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at her. Is that what you think this is about? Some piece of paper? Some legal ceremony? He crossed back to her, his hands framing her face. Sarah, you could be married to 10 men, and it wouldn't change what you are to me, what we are to each other. Then help me understand why you won't let me do what's right. Because losing you would kill me. The raw honesty in his voice shattered her composure completely. I've lived 35 years in these mountains, Sarah, alone, angry, half dead inside. You brought me back to life, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let some bastard who hurt you take that away. Sarah studied his face, seeing the determination there, but also the fear he was trying so hard to hide. What are you thinking? Marcus's expression hardened into something that reminded her why the town had once feared him. I'm thinking it's time I reminded people why they used to cross the street when they saw me coming. The morning sun painted the mountain peaks gold as Elena stood on the porch of the cabin she now called home, watching Caleb split wood with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything he did. 6 months had passed since their wedding, 6 months since she'd chosen to stay and fight for the love that had grown between them, despite all the reasons it shouldn't have worked. The sound of approaching hooves made them both look up. 3 riders crested the hill, their badges glinting in the sunlight. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead rider, Marshal Davies, the man who'd been hunting her across 3 territories. Caleb, she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the yard. He straightened immediately, reading the fear in her posture. Setting down his axe, he walked toward the porch with deliberate calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. They'd both known this day might come. The marshal dismounted, his weathered face impassive. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Marshal Davies, I believe you know why I'm here. Caleb moved to stand beside Elena, his presence solid and unwavering. State your business, Marshal. Your wife is wanted in connection with the death of Vincent Blackwood in Denver. There's been new evidence come to light. Elena felt the familiar weight of her past settling around her shoulders like a shroud. She'd told Caleb everything, how she'd killed the man who'd murdered her sister, how she'd fled into the wilderness to escape justice. He'd listened without judgment, holding her as she'd wept for all the lives that violence had destroyed. What kind of evidence? Caleb's voice was steady, but Elena could hear the steel beneath it. Marshal Davies pulled a folded paper from his vest. Testimony from 3 witnesses who saw Blackwood attack Mrs. Hartwell's sister. Seems there were folks who saw what really happened that night, but they were too scared of Blackwood's influence to speak up before. Elena blinked in confusion. I don't understand. "The charges against you have been dropped, ma'am. Turns out half of Denver knew what kind of man Blackwood was and what he did to your sister. When word got out that someone had finally stopped him, people started talking. The judge ruled it justifiable homicide." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She gripped the porch railing, her knees threatening to buckle. That's not possible." "It's more than possible, ma'am. It's official." The marshal's stern expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry you had to run for so long. Sometimes justice takes time to catch up with the truth." Caleb's arm came around her waist, steady and strong. "You're sure about this?" "Certain as sunrise, Mr. Hartwell. Your wife is a free woman." Elena closed her eyes, feeling years of fear and guilt lifting from her shoulders like morning mist. She thought of her sister Sarah, of the justice that had finally come, even if it was too late to bring her back. "There is one more thing," the marshal continued. "Blackwood had no family, and his estate was considerable. Given the circumstances, the court has awarded a portion of it to Mrs. Hartwell as compensation for what she endured. Should be enough to set you both up quite comfortable." But Elena barely heard him. The weight she'd carried for so long was gone, and in its place was something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope for a future without shadows. After the marshals left, Elena and Caleb stood together on their porch, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains that had become their sanctuary. "How does it feel?" Caleb asked quietly. Elena turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd chosen to love her when she couldn't love herself. His dark eyes held the same gentleness that had first drawn her to him, the same quiet strength that had helped her believe she deserved happiness. "Like I can finally breathe," she whispered. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she'd shed. "I love you, Elena Hartwell. Free or hunted, wealthy or poor, none of that changes what's between us." "I know," she said, and meant it completely. "I love you too." When he kissed her, it tasted like new beginnings and promises kept. Around them, the mountain wilderness stretched endlessly, no longer a place to hide, but a home they'd chosen together. As they walked back toward their cabin hand in hand, Elena realized that sometimes the very thing that drives you into the wilderness is what leads you exactly where you belong. She'd come to these mountains running from her past, but she'd found her future in the arms of a man brave enough to love her completely. The mountains had given them both exactly what they needed, not just land or freedom, but each other, and that was worth more than any fortune the court could award.